Maple Ridge Estates prided itself on order. The lawns were cut with mathematical precision. The mailboxes matched in color and height. The sidewalks were free of chalk drawings, bicycles, or anything that suggested chaos. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing unexpected was supposed to happen, and when it did, it was documented, photographed, and reported. The Homeowners Association Board called it protecting property values. The residents called it peace of mind. But underneath the polished driveways and identical shutters was something else, an unspoken vigilance that blurred the line between safety and suspicion. It began on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The sun hovered lazily over the cul-de-sac at the end of Alder Creek Lane, casting long shadows across manicured hedges. Most adults were still at work. Younger children were inside finishing homework. The neighborhood felt still. That was when someone noticed him. A teenage boy, maybe 16 or 17, standing near the sidewalk by Lot 47. He wore a hoodie despite the warm weather. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder. In his hand was a small notebook. He would pause every few steps, glance at a house, write something down, then move on. To him it was routine. To them it was suspicious. The first photo was taken from behind a curtain. The second from inside a parked SUV. Within minutes, a message thread lit up the private HOA group chat. Unknown teen walking property lines, possible casing behavior. Has anyone seen him before? One board member zoomed in on the image, scrutinizing the angle of the boy's posture as if it revealed criminal intent. Another suggested calling the non-emergency police line. A third insisted they wait and observe for patterns. But the word pattern had already been decided in their minds. The boy had circled 3 houses. He had stopped near 2 mailboxes. He had taken notes. That was enough. What no one asked was why. No one considered that he wasn't looking at windows or doors. He wasn't peering into garages. He wasn't testing locks. He was studying the landscaping, hedge heights, tree placements, flower bed dimensions. He was measuring space with his eyes, sketching outlines in his notebook with careful strokes. His name was Ethan Carter. And Maple Ridge Estates had never seen him before because he didn't live in the center of the community. He lived just beyond the gated entrance in a modest rental duplex on the edge of the development. Technically outside HOA jurisdiction, close enough to walk through the neighborhood, far enough to be considered other. Ethan had discovered Maple Ridge while biking home from school weeks earlier. He had noticed the symmetry of the lawns, the uniformity of the hedges, the way the light fell across perfectly aligned sidewalks. It fascinated him. He wasn't casing homes. He was studying design. For a statewide youth urban planning competition, Ethan had chosen to redesign suburban communities for sustainability and accessibility. His project focused on water runoff systems, native plant integration, and cost-efficient landscaping that didn't sacrifice aesthetics. Maple Ridge, with its identical layouts and controlled environment, offered a living blueprint. But to the HOA board, he wasn't a student with ambition. He was an outsider with a hoodie and a notebook. By 3:17 p.m., the non-emergency police line had been called. The report was cautious but pointed. A young male, unknown to residents, loitering near properties, writing things down, possibly surveying homes. The phrase possibly surveying carried weight. It painted a picture without proof. It suggested future crime without present evidence. 2 patrol officers were dispatched. Meanwhile, Ethan continued walking, unaware that behind tinted windows, multiple pairs of eyes tracked his every movement. He paused near Lot 52, sketching the curve of a rain gutter system that channeled water into a decorative stone trench. He admired the efficiency of it. He didn't notice the white patrol car entering the neighborhood until it was already slowing beside him. The officers stepped out calmly, hands resting near their belts but not drawing attention. To them it was a routine welfare check. To Ethan it was sudden and confusing. Across the street, 3 HOA board members stood on a driveway pretending to discuss garden mulch while watching the interaction unfold. The optics were already forming a narrative. Teen, police, suspicion validated. Ethan felt the weight of unfamiliar eyes. He could sense that whatever explanation he offered would be filtered through a lens already fogged by assumption. He held his notebook tighter, not out of guilt, but out of instinct. In Maple Ridge Estates, perception was everything. The officers asked questions. Ethan answered carefully, explaining he was working on a school project. He showed them his sketches, detailed diagrams of drainage systems, annotated notes on plant spacing, calculations scribbled in the margins. The officers' posture softened, but the board members across the street remained unconvinced. One of them crossed her arms, lips pressed thin. Another shook his head slightly as if to say, "That's what they all say." The word "they" floated silently in the air. After several minutes, the officers handed Ethan back his notebook and offered a polite suggestion to notify the HOA if he planned to continue surveying properties. That was the moment everything shifted. Notify the HOA. The same HOA that had called the police. The same HOA that had never once spoken to him before dialing a number. Ethan nodded, but something inside him tightened. Not fear, not anger. Something more subtle, an awareness that in certain spaces, explanation was never enough. The patrol car drove away. From a distance, the board members dispersed, satisfied but unsettled. The situation hadn't escalated the way they imagined. There was no arrest, no dramatic outcome, just a quiet teenager with a notebook. Yet the unease lingered, because if he wasn't a threat, then what had that made them? As Ethan walked back toward the neighborhood exit, he felt eyes on his back. He had entered Maple Ridge with curiosity and academic purpose. He was leaving with something heavier, a realization about how quickly innocence could be reframed as suspicion. He didn't know that this was only the beginning. He didn't know that the board members had already drafted an internal report documenting suspicious activity for future reference. And he certainly didn't know that within 24 hours, the same HOA would escalate the situation far beyond a welfare check, because Maple Ridge Estates didn't like loose ends. And they weren't done with him yet. The next morning would bring another sighting, another call, and this time, someone far more powerful would step into the picture. Maple Ridge Estates woke up the next morning with the quiet confidence of a community that believed it had handled a problem. The incident from the afternoon before had already been reframed in the private HOA thread. Words like proactive, vigilant, and responsible replaced suspicious and uncertain. Screenshots of the police cruiser parked beside the sidewalk circulated like trophies of civic duty. The narrative had shifted overnight. They had protected their neighborhood. But beneath the digital applause was something unsettled. Because Ethan had not been arrested. He had not fled. He had not reacted the way a guilty person was supposed to react. And unresolved suspicion is uncomfortable for people who prefer certainty. By late morning, several residents were peering through their windows again. They were waiting. Just before noon, Ethan returned. He walked through the same entrance as the day before, this time without his bike. His hoodie was lighter, grey instead of black. The same backpack hung over his shoulder. The same notebook rested in his hand. He hesitated only briefly at the entrance, as if debating whether the symmetry and careful landscaping were worth the scrutiny. Then he stepped forward. He had considered abandoning Maple Ridge altogether, but his competition deadline was 3 weeks away, and the drainage systems in this neighborhood were the most efficient he had seen. The layout provided real-world data he couldn't replicate elsewhere. He believed, perhaps naively, that yesterday's explanation had cleared the air. He believed that logic had prevailed. He was wrong. Within minutes, the HOA group chat lit up again. He's back. Same kid. Why would he return after being questioned? This is escalating. The language grew sharper this time, less cautious, more accusatory. One board member suggested that criminals often revisit locations after police contact to test response times. Another claimed the hoodie change was intentional, an attempt to appear less recognizable. A third insisted that the notebook could easily be a cover story. Suspicion thrives in echo chambers. By 12:14 p.m., someone had already dialed 911. This time, the tone of the report was different. The caller emphasized the prior police interaction. The caller mentioned repeated behavior. The caller suggested the teen might be documenting security features. The phrase potential threat was used. That phrase carried far more weight than possibly surveying. 2 patrol cars were dispatched instead of 1. Meanwhile, Ethan stood near Lot 52 again, carefully studying the stone trench that redirected rainwater. He crouched slightly, sketching the angle of the slope and noting how the gravel composition prevented erosion. He didn't notice the first cruiser approaching. He noticed the second. The sound of sirens cut through the stillness of Maple Ridge like a blade through fabric. Not loud enough to signal chaos, but loud enough to command attention. Front doors opened. Garage doors paused mid-close. Residents stepped onto porches pretending coincidence. This time the optics were different. 2 cruisers, flashing lights. Officers stepping out with more deliberate posture. Ethan froze, notebook still open in his hand. The familiarity of the situation made it worse. Yesterday had been confusion. Today felt like accusation. The officers approached with measured authority. Their expressions were no longer casual. They had been briefed on a repeat suspicious individual. That context changed everything. Across the street, 3 HOA board members gathered again, but now they didn't pretend to discuss mulch. They stood openly, watching. One of them was already recording on her phone. Ethan explained himself again. He described the competition. He described sustainable landscaping. He showed them his previous sketches, now more detailed. He pointed to calculations in the margins that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with water flow. The officers listened. But repetition alters perception. When someone is reported twice within 24 hours, it stops feeling like coincidence. It starts feeling like a pattern, and patterns demand resolution. The officers asked for identification. Ethan handed over his school ID. One officer stepped aside to verify his information. The other remained with him, posture firm. From a distance, the scene told a story the HOA preferred. Teenager, police, escalation. A few residents whispered among themselves. Someone muttered about safety. Someone else nodded approvingly at the board members as if they had prevented a burglary in progress. Ethan felt the weight of their stares more heavily than the officers' presence. He understood in that moment that this was no longer about a project. It was about perception hardened into belief. He could comply. He could explain. He could show proof. But he could not change what they had already decided he represented. The officer returned with his ID, confirming there were no warrants, no prior incidents, nothing remotely criminal, a clean record, a high school junior, an honors student. The tension should have dissolved. It didn't, because someone in the growing crowd shouted that they didn't feel safe. The word safe has power in suburban spaces. It justifies escalation. It demands action. The officers asked Ethan if he had permission from the homeowners to document their properties. Technically, he did not. The sidewalks were public access, but the homes were private. That technicality hung in the air like smoke. The HOA president stepped forward then, her posture rigid, her expression firm. She didn't address Ethan directly. Instead, she addressed the officers, emphasizing community standards and prior complaints. She referenced the documented report from the day before. She mentioned ongoing concern. She framed it as a collective unease. The officers glanced at each other. This had moved beyond a welfare check. They informed Ethan that while he wasn't under arrest, repeated complaints could lead to a formal trespassing warning if homeowners felt harassed. Harassed. The word struck harder than the sirens had. Ethan closed his notebook slowly. For the first time, doubt crept in, not about his project, but about whether logic had any place here at all. He stepped back from the property line, nodding, trying to appear cooperative. The officers advised him to leave the neighborhood for the day, and he did. But as he walked toward the exit, something inside him shifted. Yesterday had felt like misunderstanding. Today felt deliberate. Behind him, the HOA members dispersed with visible satisfaction. They had escalated, they had applied pressure, they had demonstrated control. Yet beneath their certainty was something fragile, because the officers hadn't arrested him. They hadn't cited him. They hadn't declared him guilty of anything. They had simply asked him to leave to maintain peace. Peace built on removal. Ethan exited through the gates, unaware that one of the officers had quietly noted the pattern of repeated calls from the same address, unaware that body camera footage recorded every angle of the interaction, unaware that this story was about to extend beyond Maple Ridge Estates. Because when he reached home and explained what had happened, not just once, but twice, to the one person who refused to see him as suspicious, The balance of power in Maple Ridge was about to change, and this time, the call wouldn't come from the HOA. The arrival. Ethan didn't slam the front door when he got home. He closed it quietly. That detail would matter later, because anger would have been easier to dismiss. Anger could be labeled teenage defiance. Frustration could be minimized as exaggeration. But what Ethan carried into the small duplex that afternoon wasn't loud. It was controlled. His backpack slid from his shoulder onto the kitchen chair. His notebook remained in his hand, fingers still wrapped tightly around its edges, as if letting go would make the last 2 days more real. The duplex sat just beyond the decorative stone sign that marked the entrance to Maple Ridge Estates, close enough to hear the distant hum of lawn equipment from the larger homes, far enough that no HOA covenant applied to their address. Inside, the home was modest but orderly. Books stacked neatly on the dining table, a laptop open beside a folder labeled Urban Sustainability Proposal. Sticky notes marked deadlines on a wall calendar. His mother, Danielle Carter, sat at the table reviewing documents when she looked up. She noticed the difference immediately. Not panic, not tears, something steadier. Ethan explained everything, not dramatically, not emotionally, but methodically. The first call, the second call, the officers, the repeated suspicion, the word harassed, the implication that he could be formally warned for trespassing in a neighborhood with public sidewalks. He placed the notebook on the table and flipped through the pages as he spoke, as if the sketches themselves were evidence. Danielle listened without interrupting. Her face didn't harden. It sharpened. There was a difference. She didn't react to the idea that police had been called. She reacted to the pattern. 2 calls in 24 hours, escalating language, the presence of multiple patrol cars, the suggestion of harassment. Danielle Carter understood patterns because she worked with them. For the past 14 years, she had served as a civil rights attorney specializing in housing discrimination and municipal overreach. She had built her reputation on dissecting situations that appeared small on the surface but revealed structural bias underneath. She knew how communities framed exclusion as protection. She knew how the word safety could be weaponized. She also knew how quickly narratives hardened if left unchallenged. She didn't ask Ethan if he was sure. She didn't ask whether he had left anything out. She asked for specifics, times, officer names, badge numbers, descriptions of who had been present, whether body cameras were visible. Ethan answered each question carefully. When he mentioned that one officer had stepped aside to verify his identification and that multiple neighbors had recorded the interaction, Danielle's eyes lingered on that detail. Documentation cuts both ways. By early evening, Danielle had made 3 phone calls. The first was to the local police precinct, requesting confirmation of the 2 calls for service and asking whether incident reports had been filed. Her tone was professional, neutral, not accusatory. Curious. The second was to a colleague who specialized in public records requests. The third was to the Maple Ridge Estates HOA office. That call was not confrontational either. She introduced herself calmly. She requested clarification regarding any formal complaints filed against her son. She asked whether the HOA had documentation of specific ordinance violations. She inquired whether the board had policies regarding minors on public sidewalks. The voice on the other end shifted subtly as the conversation progressed. What had likely begun as a routine inquiry began to feel like something else. Danielle did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. By 8 p.m., the private HOA group chat was active again. Someone had mentioned that the teen's mother had called. Someone had mentioned the word attorney. Speculation grew faster than facts. Is she threatening us? Are we exposed? Did we overreact? The HOA president reassured everyone that they had acted within their rights. She emphasized community safety. She referenced collective discomfort. But beneath the digital reassurance, something unfamiliar crept in: uncertainty. The next morning, Danielle didn't send Ethan back into Maple Ridge. She went herself. Not in confrontation, in presence. She walked through the gated entrance just after 10 a.m., dressed in a tailored navy blazer despite the warmth. A slim folder rested beneath her arm. Her posture was relaxed but deliberate. Maple Ridge Estates noticed immediately. The same windows that had concealed suspicion now concealed curiosity. The HOA president received a message within minutes. "She's here." Danielle didn't knock on doors. She didn't raise her voice in the street. She walked the same route Ethan had walked. She paused at the same drainage trench near Lot 52. She examined it briefly, nodding slightly at the efficiency of the design. Then she removed her phone and began recording. Not dramatically, systematically. She narrated timestamps. She described the public sidewalk. She noted the absence of no trespassing signage. She recorded sight lines showing that Ethan had never crossed into private yards. Across the street, the HOA board members gathered again. But this time they didn't look confident, because optics shift when context changes. Teen with hoodie and notebook feels ambiguous. Professional woman documenting calmly feels deliberate. Danielle eventually approached the small cluster of board members. She introduced herself. She did not accuse. She asked questions. She requested copies of any written complaints. She asked whether Maple Ridge had a formal policy regarding minors walking through the neighborhood. She inquired about the criteria used to determine suspicious behavior. The HOA president responded with rehearsed phrases about vigilance and community standards. Danielle listened. Then she asked one more question. What specific action, beyond walking and writing in a notebook, constituted a threat? There was no clear answer. Residents nearby shifted uncomfortably. A few neighbors who had watched from porches the day before now watched with different expressions, less certain, more contemplative. Danielle didn't linger. Before leaving, she informed the board that she had formally requested body camera footage from both police interactions and copies of the 911 call transcripts. She thanked them for their time, and she walked out of Maple Ridge Estates with the same steady posture she had entered with. By afternoon, the HOA group chat was fractured. Some members insisted they had done nothing wrong. Others wondered aloud whether calling 911 twice had been excessive. One quietly asked whether they had verified any actual wrongdoing before escalating. The police precinct, meanwhile, had flagged the repeated calls for review. 2 dispatches to the same location involving the same minor, with no violation, noted triggered internal curiosity. Documentation was accumulating, and documentation changes stories. By evening, an email from Danielle Carter arrived in the HOA's official inbox. It was not a threat. It was a summary, a timeline of events, a request for formal clarification, a reminder that repeated unfounded reports can create legal exposure. The tone was measured, professional, unshakable. Maple Ridge Estates had prided itself on order. Now order was being examined, and for the first time since Ethan had stepped onto their sidewalks, the HOA board realized something unsettling. They had assumed power because they believed the boy standing alone had none. They had not anticipated the arrival of someone who understood systems better than they did. Someone who knew how to transform perception into documented evidence. Someone who did not need to shout to shift control. Because the next move would not be emotional. It would be procedural. And procedure was a language Danielle Carter spoke fluently. Maple Ridge Estates had made 2 calls in 24 hours. They didn't yet understand that those calls had created a record, and records have a way of rewriting narratives. Exposure rarely begins with confrontation, it begins with paperwork. 3 days after Danielle Carter walked calmly through Maple Ridge Estates, the first ripple reached the HOA president's inbox. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't accusatory, it was procedural. A formal public records request filed with the city for all dispatch logs, 911 call recordings, officer body camera footage, and written reports related to 2 specific incidents on Alder Creek Lane within a 24-hour window. The request included precise timestamps, precise badge numbers, precise addresses. There was no ambiguity. Someone knew exactly what they were asking for. By mid-morning, word had already spread among the HOA board members. The private group chat, once filled with confident declarations about vigilance, now carried a different tone. Did she really file it? Will those recordings be public? What exactly did we say on the call? That last question lingered longer than the others. Because in the moment of dialing 911, people often speak more freely than they realize. Words chosen under the influence of fear or assumption don't always sound the same when replayed calmly days later. The HOA president reassured the board that they had acted responsibly. She emphasized again that they had expressed concern, not accusation. She repeated the phrase community safety as if repetition could solidify protection. But even she could not control what had already been recorded. Meanwhile, the police department's internal review flagged something else. 2 separate calls from residents within Maple Ridge Estates reporting the same minor as suspicious. No crime observed, no ordinance violated, no citation issued. Officers cleared both scenes without incident. Patterns worked in multiple directions. When repeated calls generate no actionable offense, questions shift from the subject of the call to the caller. An officer assigned to community relations reviewed the footage from the second interaction. He noted Ethan's compliance. He noted the absence of trespassing signs. He noted the presence of multiple residents observing from a distance. He also noted the phrasing used by the caller in the second 911 transcript, possible threat documenting security features. There was no evidence supporting that claim. By the end of the week, Danielle received confirmation that the records request had been approved. The footage would be released within 10 business days. Maple Ridge Estates had not anticipated that timeline. They assumed things moved slowly. They assumed documentation stayed buried in municipal archives. They assumed no one would follow through. Assumptions were becoming expensive. The fracture inside the HOA board deepened. One member quietly questioned whether the second call had been necessary. Another wondered aloud if labeling a high school student as a potential threat had been excessive. A third began worrying about reputational damage if the recordings surfaced publicly, because Maple Ridge Estates was not just a neighborhood. It was a brand. Real estate listings highlighted low crime rates, strong community oversight, and proactive governance. The HOA website featured language about inclusivity and welcoming environments. Public body camera footage of officers questioning a teenager for sketching drainage systems did not align with that image. Danielle, however, was not thinking about viral moments. She was thinking about precedent. She drafted a second letter to the HOA board, attaching a summary of relevant state statutes regarding false or unfounded emergency reports. She did not accuse them directly of violating any law. Instead, she outlined potential liabilities associated with repeated, unsupported calls targeting the same individual. The tone remained professional, unemotional, clinical. Maple Ridge's attorney received a copy, and that changed everything. By Monday afternoon, the HOA board scheduled an emergency meeting. Residents were invited. The agenda listed community safety review, but everyone knew what it was really about. Danielle attended, not alone. Ethan sat beside her in the modest clubhouse room, notebook resting quietly on his lap. This time, he wasn't standing alone on a sidewalk. He was seated at a table under fluorescent lights, surrounded by the very people who had watched him from behind curtains days earlier. The room felt different without police cruisers, different without sirens, but tension still lived there. The HOA president opened the meeting with a familiar script about maintaining standards and protecting residents. She emphasized that no one had intended harm, describing the calls as precautionary measures. Danielle listened. When it was her turn to speak, she did not raise her voice. She presented facts, summarized the dispatch outcomes: no violation found, no trespassing cited, no criminal behavior observed, and referenced the body camera confirmation that Ethan remained on public sidewalks at all times. She calmly noted that labeling a minor as a potential threat without evidence could create exposure not only for the HOA, but for individual callers. Silence followed. Not defensive silence, but reflective silence. A few residents shifted in their chairs. One woman who had watched from her porch during the second incident avoided eye contact. A man near the back crossed his arms less confidently than he had days earlier. Danielle did not demand apology, she demanded clarity. What policy defined suspicious behavior? What criteria triggered emergency calls? What safeguards existed to prevent bias from shaping perception? The HOA board had no written answers because until that week, they had never needed them. Maple Ridge Estates operated on instinct disguised as vigilance, but instinct is difficult to defend when examined under documentation. Near the end of the meeting, an unexpected voice spoke. One of the residents, someone who had remained quiet in the group chat, stood and admitted that calling 911 the second time may have been an overreaction. She acknowledged that no direct threat had been observed and described feeling influenced by the intensity of online speculation. It wasn't a full confession, but it cracked the facade. By the time the meeting adjourned, the board had agreed to review and revise its community safety protocols, committed to drafting clearer guidelines regarding non-emergency concerns, and agreed to circulate educational resources about appropriate use of emergency services. It sounded like progress, but exposure was not finished, because the body camera footage, once released, would not live solely inside municipal archives. Public records can be requested by anyone, shared by anyone, and interpreted by audiences far beyond Maple Ridge Estates. Danielle understood that. She had not initiated the request to embarrass the community. She had initiated it to establish truth, but truth, once documented, has its own momentum. A week later, when the footage arrived in her inbox, Danielle and Ethan watched it together. They saw the first interaction: calm officers, a cooperative teenager, no threat. Then the second, two cruisers, escalated language, the word potential threat, repeated clearly in the audio. Ethan watched silently. Danielle paused the screen on the moment the officer told him he could be formally warned if homeowners felt harassed. She knew that line mattered, because peace, built on removal, often reveals more about the remover than the removed. By the end of the night, Danielle had drafted one more letter, not to the HOA, but to the police department's oversight committee. Not a complaint, but a request for clarification regarding dispatch protocols when minors are repeatedly reported without evidence of wrongdoing. Maple Ridge Estates believed the crisis was contained within its gates. They believed the emergency meeting had resolved the matter. They did not yet understand that exposure had extended beyond their manicured lawns, because once documentation enters the public sphere, narratives expand. And Maple Ridge was about to learn that protecting property values is far more complicated when the value under scrutiny is integrity. Consequence does not arrive loudly. It arrives methodically. 10 business days after Danielle filed her public records request, the footage became official public record. What had once lived quietly on a municipal server now existed as a downloadable file, complete with timestamps, audio clarity, and unfiltered context. Maple Ridge Estates still believed the matter had been internally resolved. They were wrong. The first shift happened inside the police department. The Oversight Committee acknowledged Danielle's request for clarification regarding dispatch protocols involving repeated calls about a minor without evidence of wrongdoing. It was not framed as an accusation. It was framed as policy inquiry. Policy inquiries require answers. Supervisors reviewed the language used by dispatchers. They reviewed the phrasing officers relied upon when arriving on scene. They examined how the label "possible threat" entered the call log despite no observable criminal activity. Documentation creates accountability. In the second body camera video, the audio was clear enough to remove ambiguity. The reporting resident had not described a crime. The resident had described discomfort. The language escalated in tone between dispatch and officer arrival, subtly shifting from curiosity to caution. That shift mattered. The department quietly updated internal guidance for responding to repeated suspicious person calls in gated or HOA-managed communities. Officers were reminded to differentiate between behavior that is unusual and behavior that is unlawful. They were encouraged to document objective facts rather than speculative phrasing provided by callers. It was not a public press release, but it was a change. Meanwhile, Danielle made a different decision. She did not post the footage on social media. She did not send it to local news. Instead, she shared it privately with a civil rights advocacy organization that specialized in patterns of over-reporting within suburban associations. She removed identifying home numbers but left timestamps intact. Patterns matter more than isolated incidents. Within days, the organization responded. They had seen similar cases before: teenagers walking dogs, delivery drivers waiting too long, neighbors sitting in parked cars, communities calling police not because of danger but because of discomfort with presence. Maple Ridge Estates was not unique, but it was documented. The advocacy group requested permission to include the incident in an upcoming report examining misuse of emergency services in private residential communities. Danielle agreed. She was not seeking retribution. She was establishing precedent. Back inside Maple Ridge Estates, consequences began taking a different shape. Real estate listings in the neighborhood began receiving unusual inquiries. Prospective buyers asked whether the community had experienced recent law enforcement incidents. One couple specifically referenced having heard about a situation involving a teenager. Information travels quietly through networks no HOA can moderate. The board's attorney advised damage control. A memo was drafted reminding residents to avoid discussing ongoing matters publicly. The language emphasized privacy, professionalism, and unity. But unity built on silence feels fragile. At the next monthly HOA meeting, attendance doubled. Residents who had never participated before now sat in folding chairs along the walls. Some came out of curiosity, others came out of concern. A few came because they had children the same age as Ethan. The tone of the room had shifted. Previously, meetings focused on landscaping budgets and mailbox paint colors. Now they centered on policy. A father stood and asked what criteria justified contacting emergency services for non-criminal behavior. A retired teacher questioned whether the board had considered the emotional impact on minors subjected to repeated police scrutiny. A homeowner who had supported the original call admitted she had not watched the footage until recently. Seeing is different than speculating. The HOA president attempted to maintain composure. She reiterated that the board had already agreed to revise safety guidelines. She described the situation as unfortunate but resolved. But resolved is not the same as repaired. Danielle attended again. This time she did not bring folders. She brought restraint. When invited to speak, she summarized only one point: systems matter more than apologies. She acknowledged that individuals can make mistakes. She emphasized that sustainable change requires written standards. She reminded the room that documentation protects everyone, including residents who may one day find themselves misidentified. Her calmness continued to disarm defensiveness. Because she was not attacking neighbors, she was redefining accountability. Outside the clubhouse, subtle social consequences unfolded. Some residents who had previously avoided eye contact with Ethan now offered brief nods. A few parents encouraged their children to approach him again. The basketball hoop at the end of Alder Creek Lane saw activity it had not seen in weeks. Normalization is its own form of consequence. But not everyone adjusted comfortably. The resident who made the second 911 call began experiencing social isolation. Invitations slowed, conversations shortened. It was not organized exclusion, it was organic distance. Communities recalibrate when narratives change, and the narrative had changed. Ethan himself experienced consequence differently. The ordeal had introduced him to processes most teenagers never encounter: public records requests, oversight committees, statutory language. Instead of retreating inward, he leaned into understanding. He began researching urban planning laws related to public access spaces. He reviewed municipal codes about sidewalk usage. He studied how private associations interact with public infrastructure. What had started as curiosity about drainage systems evolved into curiosity about governance. Exposure had not discouraged him. It had sharpened him. Danielle watched this transformation quietly. She understood something the HOA board was only beginning to grasp. When you attempt to remove someone through pressure, you sometimes refine them instead. 2 weeks after the footage's release, the civil rights organization published its report. Maple Ridge Estates was not named directly, but the scenario was unmistakable. A suburban HOA initiating repeated police contact over a minor engaging in lawful activity. The report included anonymized still frames from body camera footage, blurred faces, clear context. It cited broader statistics about non-criminal suspicious person calls. It recommended statewide guidance for dispatch protocols. The report circulated among policy advocates. Then it reached local journalists. Maple Ridge Estates had believed containment was possible within neighborhood gates. But documentation rarely respects boundaries. The first reporter contacted the police department for comment. The department responded with a measured statement about reviewing procedures and emphasizing objective assessment in dispatch response. The second reporter contacted the HOA. This time, the board's attorney responded. He declined to comment on specific incidents, but reaffirmed commitment to inclusivity and responsible governance. The word inclusivity felt heavier now, because inclusivity tested under pressure reveals authenticity. Inside the neighborhood, property values did not collapse. Homes did not suddenly empty. Life continued. But perception had shifted. Maple Ridge Estates was no longer just manicured lawns and coordinated shutters. It was an example of how easily vigilance can slide into suspicion. An example of how quickly documentation can rebalance power. An example of how one calm response can ripple through systems far larger than a single street. Danielle never celebrated. There was no victory speech. There was only steady recalibration. By the end of the month, the HOA formally adopted revised guidelines requiring that residents contact non-emergency channels for non-criminal concerns and document observable facts rather than interpretations. It was a small policy change, but policies outlive emotions. Consequence had arrived, not as punishment but as structure. And Maple Ridge Estates was beginning to understand that structure, once written, could not be unwritten as easily as assumptions. But one final reckoning remained, because while policies had changed and reports had circulated, something deeper still lingered beneath the surface of Alder Creek Lane. Legacy does not arrive in headlines or sudden applause. It arrives quietly through patterns, documents, and the subtle shift of perception that outlasts a single confrontation. Maple Ridge Estates, once a neighborhood defined by uniform hedges and unchallenged authority, had experienced a change far deeper than any cosmetic adjustment to lawn height or mailbox alignment. By the time Danielle Carter walked through the gates one final morning, the streets were familiar. Children played in driveways. Joggers traced the curved sidewalks. The same homes Ethan had sketched days earlier now stood not only as structures of brick and stone, but as symbols of vigilance tested and recalibrated. Danielle's purpose that day was not confrontation. It was presence. A calm assertion that systems, when misused, could be corrected without anger, and that assumptions could not withstand scrutiny when documentation existed. Inside the clubhouse, the HOA board awaited her. Their demeanor had changed since the last meeting. Gone was the unwavering confidence of unchecked authority. In its place was something fragile, the awareness that assumptions, when acted upon without evidence, could ripple far beyond the quiet cul-de-sac. Some members avoided eye contact, others sat rigid, their hands folded tightly in laps, as though the weight of what had transpired had finally settled. Danielle did not speak immediately. She let the moment linger, observing the room, noting the expressions, the subtle signs of discomfort. She knew that accountability was rarely about dramatic revelations. It was about letting individuals face the consequences of their choices without theatrics, so that the lesson endured. She presented the final pieces of documentation, the public records confirmation, the timestamps, the body camera footage, and the civil rights report highlighting patterns of over-reporting in HOA-governed communities. Each piece was procedural, unemotional, and irrefutable. The room was silent as the weight of accumulated evidence pressed against the facade of unchecked vigilance. One by one, the HOA members acknowledged the reality, not through grand apologies but through careful language, tentative admissions, and an understanding that oversight required more than instinct. Policies would be rewritten, protocols updated, guidelines clarified. Public safety would still matter, but it would be informed by fact, not fear. Outside, Ethan watched the neighborhood he had once observed with cautious curiosity. He no longer carried the tension of suspicion on his shoulders. The ordeal had been an education unlike any classroom could provide. The interplay of governance, civil rights, perception, and responsibility. He realized that Maple Ridge had taught him more than drainage systems and landscaping layouts. It had taught him the mechanics of accountability, the weight of documentation, and the importance of measured action in the face of bias. Parents and neighbors began to interact differently. Some who had avoided eye contact now nodded politely, even smiled when Ethan passed. Children who had hesitated at the edge of driveways now played freely. The basketball hoop at Alder Creek Lane, which had been quiet for weeks, saw renewed activity, a subtle marker of normalization and trust rebuilding. Maple Ridge Estate's public image remained intact, but its internal culture had shifted. Policies were no longer just words on paper, they were tested frameworks designed to prevent future misjudgments. The HOA had learned that perception alone could not govern behavior without consequence, and that systems without transparency were vulnerable to misinterpretation. Danielle Carter's legacy in this microcosm was not just the protection of her son, it was the establishment of precedent. The documentation she had initiated, the careful navigation of procedure, the measured insistence on evidence over assumption, these would outlive fleeting emotional reactions. They would influence the way residents, officers, and even neighboring communities approached suspicion, safety, and authority. Ethan, inspired by the process, immersed himself in learning. He studied municipal codes, urban planning policies, and civil rights protections, understanding how public spaces and private associations intersect. What had begun as curiosity about design and landscaping had evolved into a profound interest in governance and justice. He had witnessed firsthand how systems could enforce bias, but also how they could be corrected when knowledge and patience prevailed. For Maple Ridge Estates, the change was subtle but lasting. The HOA meetings retained structure, but discussion had depth. Residents questioned assumptions more openly. They documented concerns carefully. They considered whether their interpretations were evidence-based or merely reflections of discomfort. The neighborhood retained order, but it now carried a consciousness of fairness previously absent. And while the world beyond the gates may never have known the minutiae of what had transpired, within Alder Creek Lane a new narrative was etched. Vigilance tempered by accountability, suspicion checked by procedure, and the quiet strength of a mother who understood both justice and patience. Ethan and Danielle walked together once more past the meticulously trimmed hedges. The sun cast warm light over sidewalks that had seen both scrutiny and reconciliation. For the first time, Ethan felt that his work, his curiosity, and even the tension he had endured were part of something larger, a lesson that stretched beyond grades, competitions, or neighborly disapproval. Legacy, Danielle knew, was rarely loud. It whispered in the adjustments of policy, in the recalibration of perception, and in the choices of the next generation. Maple Ridge Estates would remember the lesson not because of confrontation, but because the truth had been documented, the process followed, and the narrative quietly corrected. And for Ethan, the hooded teenager who had once been labeled suspicious, the neighborhood had transformed from a subject of observation into a community he understood, influenced, and, in some small but enduring way, had helped to improve. Because in the end, legacy is not about who calls the shots. It is about who shapes the systems that define the story. The sun set over Maple Ridge Estates, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, but for the first time in weeks, those shadows carried no unease. Only the steady promise of order informed by fairness, vigilance balanced with understanding, and the quiet but undeniable mark of a lesson learned. The story had ended. The legacy remained. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.